Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 24th Annual Miami Jewish Film Festival, one of the world's largest and oldest Jewish cultural arts events. We want to thank all of our members, our sponsors, community partners, volunteers, all of you film lovers, and especially our presenting sponsors, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education, otherwise known as SAGE with a soft C, and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their continued support throughout all of these years. My name is Dr. Chana Baruch. I'm a Jewish history teacher at Sheikh Hillel Community School, and I'm very excited to be moderating a virtual conversation with producer Ilan Ziv from the movie Anti-Semitism, which is premiering at this year's festival. Thank you all for joining us. I'd like to start, Ilan, by personally thanking you for doing such a thorough job of research, going back many years, connecting many dots. I'd like to say that as a Jewish history teacher, not only do I appreciate having this as a tool and eventually being able to reference to your documentary with my students, but I'm also a Jew from France who experienced a lot of anti-Semitism in my childhood as a teenager. And I chose to leave France for that reason, along with 6 of my siblings. And I'd like to tell you that for many years, I'm in Miami now 12 years, I feel that the public here doesn't really know about our story and what we faced and what we experienced. I was talking last week to a friend of mine. She had no idea about the murder of Mireille Knoll that you talk about in the documentary. And I'm happy that you're sharing our story with the world, with the larger public. So consider this my personal thank you. I'd like to ask you first, what prompted you to direct a documentary about this topic, particularly about French anti-Semitism? Ilan?
Yes, you froze. I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of the question.
So what prompted you to direct a documentary about this topic, particularly about anti-Semitism in France?
Well, the combination is banal and sublime. The sublime is that I was interested in the resurgence of anti-Semitism because I was interested in the resurgence of right-wing agitation and the connection. Anti-Semitism, I always look at it as the canary in the mine, which means it's the first symptom that something is bad and doesn't function in society. And so that was the sort of the more noble reason. The reason why I focus on France, because we pitched it in France and France 2 jumped on it. And because it was France 2 and prime time, it had to be more focused on France. However, to my defense, if you look at 19th century anti-Semitism, France is one of the capital of anti-Semitism. Germany was much, in the 30s it was transformed to Germany. But end of 19th century, France, short of Russia and Eastern Europe, is the capital of anti-Semitism. And I think today too, your internet connection is, I think today too is also, France is sort of leading a bit of it's the largest Jewish community outside of the US. It is a very large community of immigration from Arab countries. So the tension between the communities. So in a way, it's kind of interesting to look at France because it's sort of a bit of ahead, although it's elsewhere in Europe too, but France is a more, so I think given the fact all of that, there's an intellectual justification on focusing on France rather than banal reasons like the channel was French.
Wow, thank you. So I'd like to know a little bit about the process that you went through in order to gather your information. And I'm particularly interested in knowing how the people reacted when you exposed to them the reason you were doing such research. Were they cooperative? How did they react?
I never encountered any problem with reaching out to people. And what interests me always is to find kind of a narrative thread. And I'm not a classic historian, I'm an amateur. and some people say charlatan, which mean I'd like to tell stories, but to my defense, I will say that I'm trying to find sort of a narrative in a historical period so you can watch it and experience it. And so I was very interested in, it's really started with the idea of Dreyfus and Herzl and the coup, the corps militaire, because I looked at it as this Siamese twin of anti-Semitism and Zionism, and how it evolved and shaped and how it's shaping our life today, given what you experience, etc. So, and it gave me very soon a place to begin, and two characters, so to speak, which I could use. And I think from then on, so the research was originally from that perspective. By the way, I read a lot before, but what I objected, and I think that was something that guided me, when we talk about anti-Semitism, people tend to look at it as an unbroken chain from ancient Greece through Rome, through medieval Europe, through 19th century, through today, and as sort of an endless permanent disease, a virus, etc. I think it's wrong. I think that anti-Semitism is very different in different periods. And I think periods can borrow from one another, but the conditions are very different. And I think it's very different to collapse human history of such diverse cultures and eras into one leitmotif, which is anti-Semitism. So that was something I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to talk about ancient Greece. I didn't want to talk about Rome and the competition, So I wanted to start with contemporary anti-Semitism, which is very different, and go back to medieval just to show the roots of, which is the stereotypes were created culturally, but to focus much more on contemporary. And I think contemporary begins for me in 19th century with the idea of the nation state and the Jew as a pariah to the nation state, and how the Jew is part of the formation of the identity of a nation. And I think that's something that actually I'm now researching for a series on the history of European Jewry. And the whole premise of the series is that you cannot look at European history as separate from Jewish history because they're so interconnected, and Jewish identity is influencing or helping to shape European and vice versa. So that's what sort of the underlying issues that I was interested in the research. And I think the idea of Zionism was because we have anti-Jewish sentiment or pronouncement in Arab world, or part of the Arab world, or Islamism. And I was interested to look at it a little bit because I think it's very different from European anti-Semitism, although maybe the end result is similar. And also the idea that, what people don't like when I talk about the tragedy of Zionism, because they feel very offended. But what I mean it in a very profound way, that Zionism was created because of anti-Semitism. And however, the idea of the Jews moving to the Middle East implanted in the region helped to fuel and to recharge anti-Semitism. And that's what I call the tragedy, because, the Jews that came to Palestine were basically expelled from Europe. And this sort of vicious circle of how hate is being perpetuated, etc.
So thank you. I appreciate that clarification. And I do see in the movie how the anti-Semitism expressing itself in France now comes from a very different context, and it's very particular. But in the end, you do come to the conclusion that the stereotypes that fuel the hatred and the violence are the same. Going back,
yeah.
Correct.
But because I think we culturally move in a sort of organic way. Yes, the stereotypes are the same. They're being given a new meaning, but you see, you cannot really ignore the context. So the stereotype is the same, and the victims might be, suffering the same suffering. However, the context is very different. So I think if you look at anti-Semitism in France, for example, in the 19th century, you really look at state anti-Semitism or at anti-Semitism and I think the big thing for me with anti-Semitism is the state involved or not? Because if the state is involved, then you're doomed. If the state is not involved, then it becomes just another racial and racist hatred. America has a lot of racist hatred, but the American state is not infected with anti-Semitism. So you can have anti-Semitic attack in the United States, and you can have people like in Charlottesville screaming, Jews will not replace us. But the state as such, the republic as such, is not anti-Semitic. And I think France in the 19th century was infected with anti-Semitism on a state level. That was the whole Dreyfus episode. And I think, so that's one big difference with today. And I do think that you have to look at the Maghrebian immigration, anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish in a very different analysis. However, again, for Muriel Knoll, the difference might be not important because she was killed in a very cruel way. So we have to qualify what we say. The victims are the victims are the victim, always. So it's just a question that to understand the context of it, to understand how, I will beg that there's difference.
Thank you. Well, following up on that, you're mentioning how the French government was directly involved in promoting anti-Semitism in the 19th century. I'd like to ask you, or maybe argue, that in the 20th century, the French government not doing anything about the growing anti-Semitism, isn't that sort of an involvement in it, whether indirect or not? When we grew up and we were attacked on the streets and we went to the police, they didn't come to us. They didn't come to our neighborhoods, and it was common for us. And the fact that the French government knew about it and didn't do anything, isn't that an involvement as well?
First of all, I cannot argue with your experience because I've never experienced it. So which era are we talking about?
I'd like to say in the 1990s, and then it got worse in the beginning of, the 21st century.
What I know, and I might be wrong, completely wrong, and again, I cannot argue with your experience, is I still think it's different than the 19th century. 19th century, you have open anti-Semitism, in clubs, in magazine, in picture, there were 7 members of anti-Semitic, officially anti-Semitic in the French parliament. So you don't have that in the 90s. What you suffered from is the indifference, or people don't. Well, again, I'm not going to argue what you're free to interpret it any way you want. I think France refused to admit that it is anti-Semitism because I think France was shocked that it has. I think anti-Semitism in the 90s was thought as something that was the past, and the whole ethos of the new France and the new republic after the Second World War was that those things belong to the past. And also, I think France has a bigger problem than Jews. It has a problem of what to do with the largest Muslim minority in Europe and how to integrate in society. And I think the Jewish anti-Semitism is tied to this question. So I think there are a lot of sociological problems. And again, the Jews were stuck in and I think it was much more complicated, in my opinion, to admit that what you experience now is a new kind of anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish because of the reason that I said.
Well, thank you. That's fair enough. I'd like to go back to the documentary, and I'm curious to know how you got in touch with the descendants of the Alfred Dreyfus. What was the context of that? How did you come across?
Well, somebody told me that they know of one of them, and through her, she wrote an email to the whole family, and and that's how it actually was not that complicated. It was, Dreyfus family today is a very interesting family. There are a lot of them are not Jewish. They converted through the ages. Some of them are not. No one is really observant, but some of them feel more Jewish than the thing. But they're very proud on the Dreyfus heritage, and I think it's very interesting because I think there's something about French Jewry, which is the whole idea of the revolution and the emancipation, and you belong to the tradition. And I think they feel, none of them, by the way, none of them, you should just know, felt or talked about anti-Semitism in today France. And I think it's interesting, again, I don't know enough to explain why, but they see themselves very French and very French and proud of being French. And I think there's a pride in the family of being French. And yeah, no one thinks of leaving and no one thinks of, I mean, they see what I see or what you see, but they look at it as the French and they look at the French state is with them and behind them. So, which neighborhood you were born, by the way?
So I grew up in Sarcelles. I don't know if you went there and if you
No.
researched, but this is the biggest Jewish community of France, near Paris in the suburbs. And it's those neighborhoods where the police would just not come.
Right.
And now we have soldiers, and I don't know how long that reality can perpetuate itself. But it was clear to us that police felt bad. They told us, but they just simply could not come. And that's why I left, because I thought it's only going to get worse. And unfortunately, when the Jewish children were murdered in the school in Toulouse, she was in class with me. And although I was deeply hurt, I was not shocked. I knew that if they let it go for so long, eventually it'll just get worse.
Who was in the class with you?
Eva Sandler. She was in school with me, and she lost her husband and two children who were murdered at the school in Toulouse.
Oh, the rabbi's wife.
That's right.
Yeah.
That is right. On another topic I wanted to discuss, I have a question. How did right-wing anti-Semitism, which hates so many types of minorities, come to work with left-wing anti-Semitism? In other words, is anti-Semitism a bigger uniting factor than the political differences that they have among them?
Well, because I think that, listen, now you're touching back in Israel and because there's no anti-Jewish left-wing anti-Semitism that I know. There is anti-Israeli anti-Semitism or anti-Israeli left-wing. But you see, but I will be very careful here, which you might not like what I'm going to say, because I do make this distinction. First of all, the anti-Jewish left-wing, so to speak, which is the extreme left anti-Zionism. That's what you mean. It's a very peculiar, complex phenomena, which has to do with some political reasoning, some of them not. And I find it very difficult to show where the borderline is. The state of Israel is saying all the time that it operates in the name of the Jewish people. The state of Israel calls itself a Jewish state. So by that definition alone, everything the state does wrong. Okay, if I'm looking at it from the outside objectively, and if I'm a little bit more prone to prejudice, I look at it as anti-Jewish. The state of Israel said that they're staying in the West Bank because of Jewish command from God. So Israel is the one that constantly mixing Jews and Israel. Israel doesn't say it's a Israeli state. So all of that to say that some, in my opinion, some of the confusion was created by Israel. Some of the confusion, and I cannot tell you who, is quote unquote anti-Semitic because of home, because of education. But it's a far more complicated, and I think it's not helpful because I know people always like to divide the groups and look at the groups. I think we have to be very careful because I think we need to struggle for clarity and for being precise about all of that. Because otherwise every critique of Israel, which Israel now using as anti-Semitic, so you cannot criticize Israel because every criticism of Israel, of everything Israel does, Israel says anti-Semitism. So are you willing to accept it? I'm not. So, The Hague is opening investigation into Hamas and Israel, war in Gaza. Bibi Netanyahu says it's another manifestation of anti-Semitism. I think anti-Semitism is a very abused word, which I think, and I'm not the only one, by the way, and a much higher scholar than me, think it's very, very dangerous because it totally helped to diffuse the concept of anti-Semitism. By the way, the guy that wrote the biography of Ilan Ziv, the Israeli professor, is a fellow in the Center for Study of Anti-Semitism in Berlin. He teaches in the university. His whole obsession now is how the confusion between anti-Israeli, anti-Semitism, all of this, but the confusion is very dangerous because at one point in the future, people will come and will say it's all the same, and very, very dangerous for me.
So let's say that, okay, it's not so simple. There's one group, there's the other, etc. But when we see in the news in France, for example, a demonstration from the Gilets jaunes, who are fed up with the French government, and it turns very quickly to death to the Jews.
No, but Gilets jaunes are not necessarily left. Gilets jaunes is a protest movement, and I think their anti-Judaism is anti-Semitic. I mean, I'm not going to argue. That's what I'm saying. There's so many variant and colors, and we have to look at each one, not because we are scientists, but just to be able to provide a coherent answer to that. The Gilets jaunes, that element in it is anti-Semitism. But again, it's a side remark. I'm making now a film on the war against science.
The war against Zionism?
Science.
Science, okay.
And I start with anti-vax mom who are against vaccine. And you end up with anti-vax storming the US Congress on January 6th. Now, when you look deeper into it, you see how everything become a confederation in which so many different elements come in, which is, again, I think with anti-Semitism in Gilets jaunes and all of that is the same idea. You have a protest movement, justified or unjustified, and all these elements come into it and it become kind of a confederation. So again, it's not to justify, it's just to try to explain and to provide analysis. So Gilets jaunes, I know the incident you're referring, they're anti-Semitic. There's no escape to call them anti-Semitic in a classic sense, not even in a sophisticated contemporary sense.
That's why I just find it interesting that whether their agenda is anti-Semitic or not, and whether they have a problem with the state of Israel that you wouldn't call anti-Semitism or not, somehow people find a way to hijack themselves into there, but they're not really dissociating themselves from them. If they really clearly were not anti-Semitic, they would have said, this is not us, we don't stand for that, we have the right to criticize Israel, but they're not.
Because anti-Semitism is a very effective symbol and slogan, and which people have been using for thousands of years to identify themselves, to separate themselves. It's a rallying cry. For example, why I looked into Charlottesville. So why people scream, Jews will not replace it. Kind of bizarre. Jews, I think, is a 1% of American society, 5 million out of 325 million. I forget the percentage. So why? And by the way, if you look at Germany with the rise of Nazism, the Jews were, I think, 1.5%. So why suddenly the Jews become these arch enemies and arch threat? And I think there's a reason for that. And I think it's a very effective symbol to unite people. So the Jews will not replace us. They're not talking about the Jews because the Jews cannot replace you. They're talking about Blacks and Hispanic and immigrants, but the Jews are the puppeteer who are manipulating that. By the way, the killing of the synagogue in Pittsburgh, it was very interesting because the same thing. Why did he attack the synagogue? Because the synagogue was sponsoring or donating money to HIAS, a Jewish Immigration Society. So why to kill Jews who support Immigration Society? Because immigrants are the threats of the right wing in America. And the Jews, of course, are the manipulators and the puppeteer who arranged this immigrant. So Jews will not replace us in Charlottesville and this deranged guy go and kill Jews in a synagogue. Because so Jews it's a I don't have the best word for it, but it's an archy symbol for so many movements, for so many individuals. And I think the Jews are not real anymore.
So that leads me to my next question. You note in the documentary that ideas about Jews in England persisted for hundreds of years after the last Jew left the country, and that later influenced Shakespeare's writing of the character Shylock. And I'm wondering two things. On the one hand, how did they keep the anti-Jewish ideology alive for so long? And on the other hand, it seems that you're telling me that it's the same thing here. And so is there a way to get rid of that, to get rid of these preconceived ideas that always turn to the Jew as the one responsible for every problem?
First of all, I don't think there's a way how to get rid of it. There's a way how to contain it, how to quarantine it, how to fight it legally, how to fight it politically, how to fight it educationally, and make sure that it's quarantined and always kept, you know. That's the reason why people were so alarmed with Charlottesville, not because we knew the anti-Semite in the United States and we knew that, white nationalists in the United States. It just that somehow they got emboldened enough to appear in public and on such a scale. And I think that's alarmed people. So I don't think you can get rid of it. I think it's human being needs the other. By the way, one thing which I did not include in the film because it was too much, because I spent a lot of time with these professors who analyzed the brain and how from monkeys, from chimpanzee on, you need to have you and the other. And the other is always inferior to you, is always the enemy, is always alien to you, etc., etc. So Jews in the Middle Ages were the other, Jews before. So it's always the need of the other. So the need of the other, if you look at it, is almost biologically ingrained. There are fantastic studies done in the US. If a policeman see a black guy, he will mistake the iPhone for a pistol. If it was a white guy, it will not. So there's always this stereotype, which are almost biologically ingrained. I believe Jews are part of it. And this huge culture that created that and perpetuated it. And, however, does that mean that we are doomed for repeated genocide? No. Does that mean that we are doomed for pogroms? No. I think there are many ways how to fight it, how to contain it and to fight it, but it will never, quote unquote, go away.
That's interesting. So I'm jumping ahead to another question related to this. Seeing a rise of anti-Semitism in America, from what you have learned, what message do you want to send to the leaders of America today, whether the leaders of the Jewish communities or the leaders of our country?
I will tell you what the female rabbi said at the end of the film. She said, which again, I repeat, the canary in the mine. In the old mine, they use a bird, a canary, to see if the gas are toxic. If the bird died, you knew that human being. So anti-Semitism is always a precursor for something else. And you see it very much in America, which means if there's a social upheaval, if there is a social polarization, if there's a growth of dangerous ideologies, the Jews are always going to be found somewhere at the beginning of the process. Okay, so again, talking about this guy that went to a synagogue to kill Jews because he's objecting to immigration. So his real threat, so to speak, is how to delude the white race in America by all these brown and black people, which are the immigrants. So what does he do? He goes to the Jew because that's the symbol, because the Jews are behind everything. So the real enemy is immigration and the fact that America is becoming more and more multi-ethnic and multiracial. But the Jew is always somewhere at the beginning. And in France, you saw it at the period at which you talked, the people that ignored and denied, eventually it went to militant Islam. Eventually, it went to bigger massacres, but it always starts with Jews, okay, because they're the symbol. So I think we have to look at it from that perspective, which means if you attack the Jews now in the United States, we got to look at the why, and we got to fight the why, because the why is bigger than the Jews. The why is bigger. The Jews is the first symbol. So anti-Semitism in the United States, I believe, is a manifestation of a bigger wound and a bigger disease. And we got to look at that disease, because that disease is the danger. It's a dangerous one. And you saw it in Washington on January 6th, which is nothing, I mean, one guy, a few guys with the Auschwitz, but they were part of it was not an anti-Semitic attack. It was a political attack. Okay, so, but it's interesting how Auschwitz camp, the guy with the t-shirt, joined that attack, because I'm telling you, it's the symbolism of the Jew somehow, you know. So I think that the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States should not be seen in isolation, should be fought, but it should be seen as something more sinister in the making, a bigger disease. And that disease is the disease that can threaten America. So that's...
That is very interesting. I agree on that one. I want to go back to, from your documentary, we learned that French anti-Semitism seems to be connected with the historic ideas of Jews being the other, whereas German anti-Semitism seems to have evolved as a distinctly racial anti-Semitism. So I'm wondering, when the Nazis reached France with the Vichy regime, did German anti-Semitism in French society become dominant, or it was just part of the anti-Semitic scene? In other words, did anti-Semitism affect the totally assimilated Jews in the same way as those who were visibly Jewish?
Well, I think the interesting between France and Germany is very interesting, because those are the two dominant power in terms of anti-Semitism in Europe and the evolution of anti-Semitism. And France was the beginning. Mar and all those, 7 years later. And anti-Semitism in France was much more flourishing, and it was much more, I wouldn't say underground, but in the fringes of German society. However, what Mar did, and the French learned from, is that, because Villemar tried to pretend that he's creating a new understanding, which we are not religious, we don't believe in religion because we are more than human being, and therefore he coined the term of anti-Semitism. It's a racial, okay? So the birth of anti-Semitism, not as a religious hate of the other, which is a medieval Europe, but as a racial hate, that begins in Germany, okay? Much more, by the way, than in France. So by the time Nazism embraced it and elevated it to a state level, France is behind. The interesting thing, though, that Vichy, the racial laws of Vichy's, okay, which is 1940, which has nothing to do, which was not ordered by the Nazis.
Correct.
Which was contemporary, and it's interesting, and that's what Sternal explained, I think, very nicely, because the Jew was the symbol of the revolution, and Vichy was the force against revolutionary France, the decline of the church, blah, 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 blah. So the Jew and the revolution are together. And if you fight the revolution of the France that emerged after the revolution, you fight the Jews. So it was very important for Vichy to discriminate the Jews, because they were the symbol of as he said it in the film, that the last nail in the sarcophage of the revolution.
Right.
I mean, you fight the Jew and you finish with this crazy idea of the revolution. But that is very peculiar French history, French history. However, Vichy evolved and Drummond evolved. They look at Drummond as the precursor of the Nazis. So at the end, after the occupation, there was a total, but the hate in France was racial, because of, if you look at the deportation of the Jews from France, it begins with so-called foreign Jews, meaning immigrant. It moves back, at the end it moves to French Jews, Okay, so the idea is if it's a racial, there's no escape. It's not a question of he's French like us. He's not French like us because he's racially different than us. So the Vichy racial laws in 1940 are very crucial to that whole progression, because once the Jew become a race, then there's no escape. You can convert. You know, in Warsaw, in the ghetto, there was a church for the convert, and everybody went to the death camp. So it's the fact that you're converted from Judaism, it's irrelevant because racially you're a Jew.
Very, very interesting. And to continue on that note, you know, anti-Semitism in France seems to be reactionary and attached to long dead ideas of French identity, especially among the whites in France. So why does it remain so popular in that community? Like, for example, through the comedy of Dieudonné, who makes fun of the Shoah, etc., that you exposed in the documentary.
Because I think the Jew is a symbol. I mean, for Dieudonné is against the establishment, right? The racist establishment, the establishment, etc. So, by the way, I think he's anti-Semitic. So don't. I'm not trying to.
No. It's pretty obvious.
Imply that. So how does he anger the establishment? Okay, because the Holocaust became such a taboo in France and such a holy because of the participation of France in the genocide. So if I want to poke and put a finger in your eye and anger you, well, I take your little Jew that you became such a holy, etc. Also, don't forget, Jews are a successful minority in this mosaic that nobody talks about, which France is a mosaic now of minority. So the Jews is successful. They integrated. They have a history of integration. They're most successful economically. They're most successful. So I think if there's a jealousy, if you like, between unsuccessful minority that failed to integrate, or the French state did not let them integrate, because I think the French state let a Jew integrate much easier than to an Algerian-born kid from the suburb. So there's also that element. By the way, Mireille Knoll and the whole building is fascinating because it's a lot about anti-Semitism have become secondary. It's all about Jews and money and successful Jews, and you're the one that is preferred by the state, and we are shit and being speeded by the state. There's a lot of, it's very complicated. So I think Dieudonné belongs to that. Now, does he crosses into classic anti-Semitism? Sure. By the way, he's the one that confused anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism too. Okay, so he's a classic example of sort of everything.
So what's interesting about Dieudonné is that he finds many fans among the immigrants, and then I would understand from your answers why they feel that way. Jews are more integrated, they were given French citizenship for years, the Arabs not, etc. But he also finds many fans and supporters among the French whites who are French for hundreds of generations. And I'm wondering what type of anti-Semitism that is over here. Why are they attracted to his message? Because they don't live among Jews. They don't really experience,
Yeah, I totally agree. Is a federative, element. Is creating the federation of the anti-state federation by classic old Nazis or old Nazi supporters, like the National Front among the audience, immigrants among the audience, classic anti-Semite among the audience, classic Catholic, sort of old France, thing. So he's becoming, the fascinating thing and the disappointing thing for me from doing all these films, because we are really ruled by symbol and by images and by very irrational thing. And I think Dieudonné is for me a force of federation. He creates the coalition that allows all these diverse groups to be together. Okay, and some of them will be left too, to your question about left and anti-Semitism.
Correct.
It's all is a federation. Now, why the Jew is always stuck in the middle of it? That's what I told you. But the Jew is a very effective symbol, and it always works. It always works. If I want to make noise and I attack you in Miami, I will be in the headline. And if I'll be in the headline, my 10-year 10 members party organization suddenly become notorious and big, and television will talk about it day and night. So with very little effort, I put a swastika in the cemetery and I'm immediately in the news. So if I'm a totally marginal right-wing movement, okay, I can talk forever about this and about that. I desecrate a cemetery, immediately all the press will talk about it. So it's Jews are good for right wing. For very little resources, I can create a lot of noise.
Well, I find it so paradoxical, and maybe that shows you the hatred that most of the victims, we're going to talk about Mireille, we're going to talk about Sarah Halimi, etc., Ilan Halimi, way before that, are Jews who are not so wealthy. They live in those poor neighborhoods, and they don't represent the wealth. They're next door neighbors to those immigrants because they can't afford living in the higher neighborhoods, and they're the ones who are being killed because they're rich.
No, of course, because that's what the Jews and money, which he talks in the film very effectively.
Correct.
Now, the beauty of the Jew can be Bolshevist and the Jew can be capitalist, and the Nazi never saw a contradiction. There can be everything, which means it's almost like a mythological figure, which can be full of contradiction, rich and poor, and that's the beauty of the beauty. That's the historical thing that we inherited. Is the symbol.
Yeah, that reminds me of a movie that we showed at the festival a few years ago called They're Everywhere. I believe it was by Yvon Attal. Have you watched the movie? And have you even met maybe with the producer or not?
No, I think that I've seen the movie. This is the filmmakers.
That's right. That's
yeah,
right. Ils sont partout.
Yeah, who is going to the therapist and always.
That's correct.
Yes. Yes.
That is correct. I think it touches upon that particular.
I think it's a very nice film, but I think the humor is kind of a bit painful because if you look at it logically, it doesn't make sense. It never did make sense. It didn't make sense even in the Middle Ages. And every time people try to find objective reason, economic reason, why I always poo-poo it, because you cannot look at it logically. You have to look at it on the level of mythology. The same way you don't analyze Greek mythology in a logical sense, but you talk about Prometheus and Sisyphus as symbol, okay? Jew is the same way. Unfortunately, we're Jews and we are living the symbol, but the Jew is a symbol. And you cannot analyze, the Jews were more dominant. But by the time Hitler came to Germany, Jews did not control the bank. Jews did not control the biggest enterprise. Okay. So Jews were totally on the decline economically, and that's before the Nazis, because of social changes which are not relevant. So, but why to elevate them into Jewish business? It's always, you cannot look at it logically. You have to look at it on the level of myth and mythology. The same way you analyze other stuff.
So going back to the murder of the Jewish children in Toulouse, many Jews felt, as you said in the documentary, that, there was no outrage. There were no people going down the streets, when Jewish children were being murdered in a school. Do you think that today it has maybe finally registered with the French public after more events? Do they realize that many Jews have left? Is this something that has finally gotten into the conscience of the average person?
To be honest, I don't think it's the issue of the Jews. I think that more and more people understand what I said before, that the Jew is the beginning symptom of a bigger disease. And you cannot, because up to Toulouse, including Toulouse, the Jews were like, okay, so the Jews are not me, so they have a problem, I sympathize. But I'm sorry, it's their issues. You don't go out to the street because miners in the north are unemployed, because it's the miners, let them do the union. So, unfortunately, we live in a society in which we fragment like that, So I think people look at it, I'm sympathetic, I'm not anti-Semitic, etc. But it's very horrible what happened, but it's the Jews, and the Jews will find, I think because of Charlie Hebdo and Bataclan and the hyper-cacher, people understood that the connection is deeper. And like the teacher that was decapitated now.
A few months ago.
Yes, the capital had nothing to do with Judaism. So people understand that there's a bigger disease, if you like, and the disease is dangerous because the disease is anti-French and anti-French values. So I believe that somehow, at least I don't know how many, but the intelligentsia in France understand now the same way the revolution understand that the Jew is integral part of the republic. And if you take the Jew out of the republic, you have no republic. So the republic is being, and you look at Macron, I mean, he is a Republican. So he understands very well the connection. And I forget what was the name of the prime minister during the Bataclan.
Was it François Hollande?
No, he was the prime minister of Hollande, Val, no?
Who, Val? I don't remember.
The prime minister of under Hollande. He said, if he said after the Hyper if 100,000 Jews leave tomorrow, we don't have a republic. The republic is not going to be the same. So he meant it not because of the numbers, because France is like over 60-something million. It's the symbolism of the Jews. And I think that's what people understand now, that the Jews, for historical reasons, are integral part of the Republican ideas and the Republic identity. And I think you have to fight for the Jews, not because they're Jews, because you fight for the Republic.
So the question becomes, I know we discussed, if you had a message for Jews in America, but considering that entire very complex reality in France with many Muslim immigrants who have not been integrated, we're talking in the millions, and whatever you've explained about the Jews, what do you think the French government can do to save the Republic? Do you think that there is really a light at the end of the tunnel? Many Jews have been leaving and many Jews are still leaving. And I'm wondering, do you think that there is hope even?
Yes, I think. It's not, I'm not sure about the hope, but I'm sure that France is a good place to fight for all of this issue. And if I was French as a Jew, I would have never left. I'm not making a statement about you, because I think France is, France and America are the two places that it's worth fighting, because there is long tradition of republicanism and secularism and liberal democracy, which are under attack in both the society. So would you leave the United States tomorrow because of Trump and the mega movement, et cetera, et cetera? So I think that both places, I think, however, and this I come with my own prejudice, depends how old you are, because those things take a long time to resolve themselves. So I just turned 70. So I feel I'm not going to see a real change in the US because the war is going to take to resolve itself. But I tell my kids, you got to fight because it's a place worth fighting for. So if you want to spend the rest of your life in fighting, if you feel, because it will take a couple of decades, France will resolve its problem, I believe. But again, those things take time, long time.
And at what cost also?
So if you want to live normal life and you want to raise children and you want to say, I appreciate what you're saying, Ilan, but I want to live a normal life, then you say, okay, I leave. But France, I think, is a place worth fighting for.
I just, it's so complex that I don't know.
Yeah, I believe in history and I believe in the Republic and I believe in the revolution and what it did. You cannot understand America without the French Revolution. So I believe in all those things, and I believe those things is very powerful. Again, at one point they're being attacked. There was Vichy in America. Now there's the MAGA movement and 74 million supporting Trump. There's a whole party that doesn't believe in democracy. I believe that at the end, you will see the Constitution and the belief in Constitution will triumph, but it will take time and the war is going to be kind of long and complicated, hopefully with very little violence.
Hopefully, yes. On this note, I'm still very much involved, reading the French media and involved with the communities who are still in France. And as a sort of solution, I'm seeing a big discussion, and it's a very heated one when you see the elections are coming up in a year. And you see that Marine Le Pen, even in the previous election, she made it to the second round, and that she's working on getting there. And it seems from at least many people feel from what I'm reading that she seems to be the only solution because she's the only one willing to name the problem instead of being politically correct, etc. And I find that there are more and more Jews who are voting for her, encouraging people to vote for her, even though she comes from a party. Her father was a Holocaust denier, and she's from the far right in France, but they almost feel like if she's the only hope, maybe it's worth voting for her when we know clearly that there is anti-Semitism in the party. I'd like to know, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a suicidal idea. And I think Jews will see it. If she will ever get elected and Jews were part of it, they will regret it for generations to come. I think people like this are so toxic and so contaminated. And again, I don't want to go too much into American politics, but look at Trump and how you saw Trump at the beginning, and people justify the tweet and justify the crudeness, etc. But ultimately, he's doing the right thing, standing up to China. I'm just putting in quotation, whatever your personal belief. And at the end, you see January 6th, what happened. So what I'm saying is, Marie Le Pen is the same. Marie Le Pen is the same. And the party is the same. It's a party that by the time it will come to power, it will never relinquish power in an organized, way. Hitler never gave up. Hitler came to the election, won power by election. Only 32% voted for Hitler. So those guys, when they come to power, they never leave power voluntarily. And if Jews are participating, they will be sorry for generations. And I do believe that ultra-right in France has anti-Semitism in it, and anti-Semitism will not be exercised, and she will always run with this group of tigers that she needs to tame, a la Trump, and throw a bone here and a bone there, and to pacify the beasts that she's tried. So, and I know that there's no alternative in France, but can I ask you, which has nothing to do with the recorded, you cut it out, what's wrong with Macron? I know he's a horrible guy, and what's so wrong in Macron to vote Le Pen against?
So I'm not going to speak for myself. I'm no longer there. I left a long time ago. But what I'm hearing from the people is that they're not seeing concrete measures that are actually going to make change and provide more safety for them to think of staying there in the long term. They feel that there's a lot of political correctness. And look, you yourself showing in the movie, in the documentary, how so many of the murders, they would hesitate to label them as anti-Semitic. And even today, it's not so clear cut. When somebody goes into a crowd with a taxi and says Allahu Akbar, they just call him a deranged individual. They don't want to point finger to Islamism. They feel that she's the only one who says it as clearly as needs to be said.
I disagree with you on Macron. I mean, he's now under attack by the left because of his new legislation on Islam. I mean, I disagree. I think that we have to, how should I say it nicely? Hopefully you're not going to use the recording. I think the problem with the Jews is that because of the Holocaust, because of the audacity and the horrors that happened, the magnitude of the genocide, we're so traumatized at one level. And I think in many ways, we're a little bit over exaggerating. How many people were killed in France because of anti-Semitism? Let's look at the numbers. 5, 6, 7. Every murder is a horrible murder. But if you look at it at the globality of society, okay, how many Jews were killed? We can count, we know all the murders, and each of them, and we know what the murders symbolize, etc. So from that to jump to I'll vote for because he's Islam. Islamism is a problem of France with Marie Le Pen, without Marie Le Pen. Marie Le Pen is not going to resolve it the same way Trump didn't resolve anything. He only aggravated. So she will be very big on slogan. She's not going to have martial laws in the suburb of France, and she's not going to reinstituting the death penalty to kill everybody who is an Islamist. She's not going to do any of that. So the only thing she will succeed to do is Alatam, divide the society more and create more antagonism and more hate. That's the only thing she will succeed to do. Okay, even though in her dream she's dreaming of death penalty, abolishing immigration, expelling new immigrants, whatever. Choose whatever measure you think will work. So people get very desperate because they see the problem as a huge problem. It is a big problem. Okay, and so this guy will resolve it. Nobody will resolve it. Society will resolve it. How are you going to resolve it? In the same way, it's moving very slowly, and it's painstakingly, because there's no magic solution. With Macron, with Hitler, with Trump, America, let's make America great again. All of this slogan, this nationalist slogan, are worthless. They're thin as a paper. The society has a problem. They have to be resolved by society. There's no magic solution. A crayon. So
correct. And what these people are seeing, and again, I'm not really comparing the situation in France to the situation in America. Like you said, there was a particular way things took place and developed in France, but people do not feel that Macron himself or the left before him or anyone before him was really addressing the issue. And it's not about the number, Ilan. It's not about, okay, 6 Jews were murdered. It's about the fact that in 2021, like you said before, because hatred will always exist. You said hatred will always exist, and what we have to do is learn how to contain it, how to educate. I agree with you 100%. But the fact that it got to a point where it's being expressed through murders in 2021, and that it took so many years for people to actually label those murders as anti-Semitism, like you said, the French government doing that's a big worry.
No, but first of all, because there's a big difference from before Sarah Halimi and before Ilan Halimi and now. I don't know of any contemporary murder in France in 2021, which is anti-Semitic. And the fact that there might be a murder somewhere doesn't, for me, say the whole edifice is wrong. So what I'm saying is you got to contain the problem. There's a problem of integration and radicalization of some minority of the Muslim society. There's a lot of quote-unquote, you saw in the film how there's a lot of law-abiding, peaceful, loving, wanting to integrate Muslims. Muslims are 4 million people. They're not a group, they're individual. They are radicalized. The radicalized, that's what Macron is trying with schooling, with imam who will be chosen by the state, with synagogue not getting funding. What else he can do? What do you think he can do? Nothing. He does exactly within the law. What can be done? You can go outside the law, then you don't have a democracy, and then you'll see how the Jews will behave once democracy is over and there's some kind of an authoritarian regime that does forget about the law and forget about the constitution. So what I'm saying is America has a big problem with racism, which we don't talk about. Okay, much bigger than anti-Semitism in France, I believe, because blacks in the United States is 40 million or more. Okay, much bigger. Much bigger. This police shooting that happened in the US, how many Jews, we're going back to the numbers, how many young black kids were killed by the cops in the United States without the cops ever coming to trial or being acquitted? Bigger problem, much bigger problem. Well, so do you need some kind of a right-wing guy that will fix the problem, or a left-wing black guy that will dictate? I mean, so you live with this problem, unfortunately, and you try to fight and you try to contain, but you can't, there's no magic solution for racism in America. Nobody has the solution. There's piecemeal here and piecemeal there. And racism, I think, in America, in my opinion, is much more threatening, okay, than anti-Semitism in France, just because of the proportion of the population. They're 14% black, they're not 1%.
I hear you 100%, and I don't think necessarily voting for one party is going to bring the solution. I think the solution has to go with going back to the Republican values. What is the Republic?
Absolutely.
And how do we go back to the Republic? But what you were asking me about why would French people feel that way? You know, when you have a few murders, and then something that's not mentioned in the movie, but is worth mentioning, when the murderer of Mireille Knoll is acquitted or deemed unfit for judgment, because he was under the influence of marijuana, the Jews are feeling like, so hold on, we already have a big problem of anti-Semitism. And now with the justice system, what message does that send to all the people who already have been to jihad? If you smoke pot and you kill a Jew,
I don't think it's fair. It's not because of marijuana. Again, I'm not a psychiatrist. I never examined him, and I know the murderer of Sarah Alemi, who was also declared unfit for trial,
correct,
and not because of marijuana, because of hallucination, etc., etc. So what I'm saying is, again, I'm not going to get involved because I never check. By the way, I interviewed a psychiatrist. I interviewed in the film. Okay, was part of the team that looks at the murderer of the gang of Barbar that killed Halemi. So, and I talked to him, because he was recommended to me by the psychiatrist to declare the murder of Sarah Halemi as unfit. So what I'm saying is I don't want to get in because I don't know enough. I believe that those guys are professional and they made a professional judgment. You might disagree with the professional judgment, okay? But to draw from that this is part of the attempt to cover it up, I'm not willing to make that judgment.
No, that's
only
not where it's going.
Two cases, Sarah Halemi is one, and Mirel Knoll is another one. And I'm not willing, first of all, Mirel Knoll is not the trial. So I'm not willing to make that categorically that this is a symptom of tolerance to violence against Jews. Again, in the Sarah Halemi, I do know the professional, and he's a professional. You might say he's a bad professional. You might say he's wrong, and I'm sure there can be a debate among psychiatrists: was he right or was he wrong? But it's part of the legal profession of
that is correct, and I don't think it's about questioning whether the justice system is doing this. No. Let's say everybody did their job thoroughly, and this is what came out, and it's fair. It doesn't take away the fact that the Jews of France feel sort of a desperation, because to them, it looks like when Jews are being murdered, at least the recent ones, those two, and not being sent to jail for whatever the reason, it's almost like people are going to equate the two and feel the message that it's not so hard to murder a Jew in France in the 21st century. In any case, this is the feeling that I feel like I'm getting from all the reading that I do in the French press.
But you have to be very careful, because I happen to know a lot of French Jews too. None of them is concerned the same way you are. None of them, actually, when I moved into anti-Semitism, they thought it's kind of interesting, but nobody felt the urgent, thank you, Ilan, for doing something about us. So they are quote unquote Jews too, married to Jews too. So, which means they're Jews and they're Jews and they're Jews.
That's
and
right.
it has to do with people's personal feeling, people's identity, etc., etc. So I will not categorize all the friends. By the way, the whole Dreyfus family that I traveled with them and I became friends with them, none of them talks about anti-Semitism the way you talk.
Okay. Correct, because I grew up in those suburbs with the immigrants and with the violence. Different experience.
Here we go. And the daughters of Knoll, the granddaughters that I interviewed in Israel, the mother took them from school and moved to Israel, they talk about it exactly in the same way. So there's a personal experience that colored which is totally legitimate, because that's who we are as people. And some people that hasn't done because they were born in this fifth thing in arrondissement in Paris, and the father was a professor in the university, and the neighbors were some intellectual with pipes in cafe. They don't have the same, and they are quote unquote Jews too. So that's what I'm saying. We got to be very
put everything back into perspective. I agree.
People are people. They're individual and clouded by their own
experiences. Heads up, I have 3 more questions, if that's okay. One of them is, as an Israeli who has fought, I believe, in the Yom Kippur War and who eventually left, what have you learned from this experience of researching on that topic?
Are you implying that? Listen, I never learned. I didn't learn But Israel learned bad things because of this mixture of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and how dangerous I think it is. No, I left Israel because, again, I'm clouded by my own personal background. And no, so I did not, what I did learn is it became much more concrete for me, is the disillusionment of the 19th century that gave birth to Herzl, the idea of integration that failed, how, and those roots of Zionism, okay, that was so, I didn't underestimate, but again, because it was not my experience. Another thing, so that's one thing which I did learn. And yeah. But I'm become, because I left Israel and I've been living for many years outside of Israel, I see the value of the diaspora coexisting with Israel, okay? And the idea that Jewish history is very complicated and Israel is a very small part of Jewish history, also historically, even in biblical time and Roman time. And the Judaism that we know was created in the diaspora, not in Israel. And I think Israel and the US now are the biggest center. So I'm, that's the reason why I wanted to make this series on the history of European Jew, because I believe diaspora Judaism is the movement that shaped everyone, including the United States, including Israel. So there's a lot to be said about diaspora Judaism and the values that it had and politics that it had, etc., etc.
I think you should make a documentary about that. That would be very interesting to know.
That's what I want to make, a series on 6 parts on the history of European Jews.
Beautiful. Let us know when it's out. We're looking forward. 2 more questions. So at the end of the video, the last speaker notes that anti-Semitism creates an identity and therefore has become indispensable to certain groups in French society. So does that mean that anti-Semitism as an...
By the way, I don't remember that statement.
I believe that it was one of the, I don't know if it was sociologist, historian, and he's talking about creating an identity and then eventually expressing their rage, but they needed an identity, and it was really through anti-Semitism. It was, I mean, one of the men in the end, I don't remember exactly who he was, and that made me wonder.
The journalist, yeah.
Possibly.
In the court.
Correct. So does that mean that anti-Semitism as an intellectual force will remain alive, or do you think that it will continue to build in violence?
Anti-Semitism will always be violent because anti-Semites divide themselves according to different colors, like we divide ourselves. And there's so-called intellectual anti-Semitism, and there's vulgar, violent anti-Semitism. So that's the same thing about when we talked about Marine Le Pen, etc. Anti-Semitism needs to be fought, period. I don't care if you believe on it with a coat and in a cocktail party, or you fight in the street and then Jews, Juif, la France c'est pas pour toi. It doesn't matter. For me, they're all the same. So everybody who believes in racism, in white nationalism, in anti-Semitism, they're all for me the same diseases. I don't believe there's peaceful white nationalists and violent white nationalists. I don't believe there's intellectual racists and the violent racists. For me, they're all the same. So there's no, anti-Semitism will always be violent, or at least you have to deal with it as a violent idea that needs to be fought, period. Even the adherent might speak in a very beautiful language and be sitting in parliament or in cafes. They have to be fought exactly as if in the street, desecrating a cemetery or attacking a Jewish man with a yarmulke and the thing. It's the same. For me, it's always the same.
All right. So are there any particular anecdotes that you would like to share about the process of making this documentary?
I never thought of this. Anecdotes. No, listen, for me, this is a personal, it's not anecdote. I lived for 2 months in France to make, because there was such a huge time pressure. I couldn't fly back and forth, so I lived. So for me, it was a way to learn about French society in a very deep way. 2 months, I spoke my broken French and talked to people and met people that I normally would not have met. So it was a fantastic, and for me, again, anecdotes. No, it's not particular anecdote. It was a very meaningful experience. Out of it comes this idea of European Jewry, because I'm fascinated by the depth of history and the complexity of history. And again, I believe that all the ideas that we hold dear were created by European Jews. So I cannot put it in a nicer way. So all this idea that I think, that was for me a process of discovery.
Thank you. Lastly, why do you think the story is important to share?
Primarily because, which I keep repeating myself now for the second time, anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. Jews are the victims, but anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. It's a problem of society that tolerate, manipulate, etc. And as we learn in history, it's always a precursor for a bigger problem. So if you say anti-Semitism, it's nothing to do with me because it has to do with the Jews, you're mistaken, because it will come and it will bite you in the back. It is something bigger. It shows some kind of a disease in the society. And this disease will devour you too. We saw it in Germany. We saw it in every other society. We saw it in Vichy France. We saw it everywhere. We saw it now, even in France, when you talk about the 90s and anti-Semitism, and nobody paid attention. Eventually you had Bataclan. Bataclan was not Jewish. There was 100 people killed. And the 80 people killed in this were not Jews. Maybe there were some Jews, but it was not a Jewish attack. So the numbers actually even grew. Okay, so what you see is what they call anti-Jewish eventually become anti-French and evolve everyone. So you have to fight the disease, and you have to look at anti-Semitism as the precursor, that the fever that shows you there's something wrong in the body. And because of that, anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. It's a Jewish problem because the Jewish are the victims, but it's not a problem, it's not a Jewish problem, it's a societal problem. In America, the same way, in France, the same way everywhere.
Thank you very much to producer Ilan Ziv from the movie Anti-Semitism for joining us. Once again, thank you to all of our members, sponsors, community partners, volunteers, all of you film lovers, and especially our presenting sponsors, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education, SAGE, and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their continued support throughout all of these years. And thank you, our audience, for participating in the 24th Annual Miami Jewish Film Festival. Have a great rest of your day.